Is it?
Yep.
Okay, great. So it looks like Brother Lee has us recording. So welcome to tonight's Come Follow Me study. My name is John Clark. I'll sort of be leading the discussion. And as people come on, if you have questions or whatever, let's go ahead and ask them. I have chat open, and you can ask them. I don't mind if you ask them over the microphone. So I'm going to go ahead and start by welcoming you again and start sharing my screen so that we can talk about what's here. Share my desktop. So here we go. So we should be looking at a slide about what the reading is. Fortunately, in the New Testament, the readings are not very long. This is really good, as opposed to the Old Testament and even the Book of Mormon. There are very few. This week and next week, there are 2 chapters each, you know? So for this week, we're looking at Matthew chapter 5, starting today, and Luke chapter 6. And for the next week, we're looking at Matthew 6 and 7. I don't know why they divide this up the way they do, because Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is the Sermon on the Mount. So I don't know why it's divided up. It just seems odd to me. But, and it's not like Luke goes over the same information as in Matthew 5. A tiny bit, the Beatitudes are in Matthew chapter 5 and in Luke chapter 6, but they're just different. So it just is a little bit strange to me. So the purposes of the Come Follow Me study is to provide background and context for the Come Follow Me lessons. It's not to be another Sunday school lesson. I will usually leave a lot of stuff open for the gospel doctrine teachers to choose for the Sunday lessons or for the youth lessons. But background and context, look at resources for individual study or study in the family. And then I have my email listed on the bottom here in case you have questions or you want a copy of the PDF file that this is, that I'm showing, or if something comes up in your reading, or if watching the discussion, you know, whether it's on YouTube, you have questions that come up. So just a little bit of a background. I thought this was just an interesting thing. This is the contents of the Bible sort of set out like the periodic table of elements. So if you're science-minded, maybe this is an interesting way to look at stuff. This is the New Testament. The pink is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're gospel narratives. And then this orange is the book of Acts, which is a continuation of the story of the apostles after Christ's ascension. And it's generally regarded that the author of Luke is the same author as the book of Acts, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Then we have Paul's letter to the churches. These are these light orange ones: Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians, and Thessalonians. Then this even lighter sort of goldenrod color are Paul's letters to individuals. So these are letters to cities or locations. These are letters to people. So Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. And then these are general letters to the Hebrews, from James, from Peter, another one from Peter, from John, and then from Jude, and then the book of Revelation, which is called an apocalyptic. Apocalypse just means prophecy, okay? And again, the prophecies of John seemed so dire at the time that now apocalyptic sort of means catastrophic future. Do you know what I mean? When we talk about the apocalypse, it's always catastrophic. But apocalypse in Greek originally just means a revelation. So on this, excuse me, let me go ahead and just do this view a little bit better. I made the mistake of swiping, so now everything's kind of weird. And now we'll zoom to fit. That'll help. On this side, on the right side, is kind of an idea, a general scholarly idea of when these books were written, were actually recorded. So Galatians was probably first. You'll see that though the Gospels are first in the library known as the Bible, the series of documents that are together as the New Testament, that the Gospels were written sort of in the middle toward late. So Mark, Matthew, Luke and Acts are written by the same person, we assume, and John. So it's just two ways of looking at the contents, okay? And I thought that if you had a scientific mind, the periodic table of the Bible is kind of an interesting way to look at stuff. So I want to talk a little bit about the two Gospels, do an overview of the two Gospels that we'll be looking at today. We'll start with Matthew, and then we'll move to Luke. Next week, not next week, but next time we meet, we have readings that include the Gospel of Mark. And so we'll talk about the general overview of Mark. And we don't have John for a little while, but if I'm feeling brave, we might do an overview of John next time too. So Mark is probably the first recorded gospel. It is the smallest in terms of number of verses. And I'll just tell you a couple of characteristics of the book of Mark, but we'll go into that in future, more specifics in the future. Mark, the Gospel of Mark, starts at the baptism of John the Baptist. There's no birth story, there's no pre-birth story, and it ends with people going to the tomb and the angel saying, "He is not here, he is risen." But there's no appearances to his disciples afterwards in the book of Mark. It's really short and contains a lot of teachings. So in many ways, the book of Matthew is an expanded version of Mark's gospel. It includes about 90% of the material that's in Mark. So Mark has about 678 verses. 600 of them are referenced or are the same as the material in Matthew. Matthew's narrative adds 48 verses of birth stories, stuff that happens before, and about 400 more verses of Jesus's teachings. And almost half of these, so 200 of those 400, are very similar to those found in the Gospel of Luke. Okay? Parts that are unique to the Gospel of Matthew are parts of the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? Matthew's Sermon on the Mount covers 3 chapters, the ones that we're looking at. And so there's some extra stuff that isn't in Luke, that isn't in Mark, that isn't in John. The parables of the wheat and tares, the hidden treasure, the pearl of great price, the unmerciful servant, and the workers in the vineyard, the ones that are engaged and they're all paid the same wage, no matter when they started working. Those are unique to the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew, I thought this was very interesting. We toss out the Sermon on the Mount, but Matthew is the only gospel that places the Sermon on the Mount as being delivered from a mountain. So it's thanks to the book of Matthew that it's called the Sermon on the Mount, because in the others, it doesn't reference it being delivered from a mountain. In fact, Matthew has a lot of references to mountains. The Mount of Transfiguration, the mount that Jesus goes to, the devil takes him to, having been tempted. Mountains appear a lot in the book of Matthew. And just as a subtle side note, stuff that we would consider covenants or ordinances or things that would occur in our modern day temples do not happen at the temple in Jesus' day. They happen on mountains. Okay? Just keep an eye out for those things. Matthew's text quotes Old Testament prophecy more than any of the other Gospels. More than 40 times with an explicit phrase like, "It is written," and then they'll quote, then that gospel will quote the Old Testament, and another 21 times without such a phrase. Because Matthew, we suppose, is written very much to the Jewish followers. In Matthew, Jesus restricts his mission during his lifetime to the Jews and the house of Israel. It's only in the last verse of Matthew that the risen Jesus commissions his followers to go to the nations, go to the Gentiles, okay? And Jesus' final words in Matthew are, "I am with you always." And one of Jesus's names is Emmanuel, which is God with us. So "I am with you always" is a reference to his name or title, Emmanuel, God with us. So those are some of the characteristics of the book of Matthew. And so you'll see them played out a little bit here in these chapters that we're looking at this week. Okay, so we start in Matthew chapter 5. It's the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount and continues in Matthew 6 and 7. Matthew 6 and 7 are next week's readings, but I'm going to deal with them today as a piece because it's the same sermon. Okay. And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, the disciples came unto him. So that in chapter 5, verse 1, is where Matthew declares that he sets the sermon on the mountain, on the mount. If you go to Israel, you know it's not a mountain like the Rocky Mountains. When I was a kid and lived in Utah, and you draw the picture of the Sermon on the Mount, it was way tall. It's a sermon on a slight slope. When you actually go to the Holy Land, it's just a little rise. It would be considered barely a hill here. One of the things that we talk about in Matthew chapter 5 is the notion that the people who are gathered, his disciples who are gathered, not the apostles, but his followers, ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Just as a little background note, the law of Moses declares that the children of Israel are a light of the world. And that's one thing that the Jews at the time took as very serious and sort of made them feel like special, chosen. You know what I mean? You're the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Okay, so I highlighted the word bushel because I promise you, even though you might know what a bushel is, I can tell you that probably your children do not know what a bushel is. My experience in seminary a few years ago, when you ask what a bushel is, most kids would say it's a little bush. So we'll take a look at what a bushel is. I'm sure all of us know what it is, but sometimes words that we know, our children don't know. So it's a good idea to make sure, even though we know, we need to make sure that our family members know. But they put it on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Okay, so one of the things that Jesus does in this, he also talks about the people being the salt of the earth. Okay. And he's not saying you need to do anything to be the salt of the earth. You are the salt of the earth, like you claim. But instead of it making you special and better than everybody else and more favored in God's sight, what he points out is it gives you added responsibility, an added responsibility, added stuff you have to do. Okay. It's like when you take covenants, you have added responsibility, added things that you are responsible for doing. So in verse 16, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify who? Not yourself, but your Father which is in heaven. Okay. So oftentimes we like to take the things that we do well and shine a light on them for ourselves, but in being the light of the world, we're to shine so that people can see our good works, and that those good works help them to glorify their Father which is in heaven, not us. Okay. Just some vocabulary for Matthew chapter 5. A bushel, and I'm sure everybody here knows this, but just so your kids know, is a U.S. measure of capacity that's equal to 64 pints, about a little more than 35 liters used for dry goods. In Britain, it's 8 imperial gallons, which makes it a little more than an extra liter, okay, used for dry goods and liquids. It is also a container that holds a bushel, like this illustration, okay? So you don't take a candle and stick a basket over the top of it, is what it says, or a large quantity. I love you a bushel and a peck. If you remember that little tune from Guys and Dolls, it's a large quantity. Okay, that's an old one. Many of you may not remember, but a bushel of things is sometimes used as a large quantities of stuff. It's we'd say kind of a buttload of stuff. You know what I mean now? Also in verse 18, we read about a jot or a tittle. Literally, the Greek word for jot is iota. It means a tiny little particle. And the word that is translated for tittle in Greek means a dot or a point. It's variously translated as not an iota, not a dot in the English Standard Version. Not the smallest letter or one stroke of a letter is the, let me see, what's the CSB? It'll come to me, give me a second. Standard Bible is the SB. It'll come to me what the C is for. And then not even the smallest detail is the NLT. I don't know why these are eluding me at this moment in my career. The New Living Testament is the NLT, okay? And then later on in verse 26, it talks about a farthing. You won't get out of prison till you pay the uttermost farthing. A farthing is a monetary unit in Britain that is equal to a quarter of an old penny. It's no longer in use. But the second definition is the important one in the sense of things. It's the least possible amount. And we'll take a look at these. We already saw about the bushel, that you don't light a candle and stick it under a bushel basket, okay? And we'll take a look at a jot and a tittle, and we'll take a look at a farthing. So jots and tittles are a little bit of an extension of the scribes. We talked a little bit about the scribes last week. So here's a little bit more. In biblical times, scribes were in demand to prepare copies of Israel's sacred literature on parchment scrolls. This was before printing press. So every time you needed a new copy, it was done by hand. Many scribes devoted themselves to preserving and copying the scriptures. So not only did they copy them, they were responsible for reviewing them and quality control. So every little thing had to be exact, the jots or the tittles. When there were prophets in Israel in Old Testament times, I'll need to fix this because I missed a letter here. Scribes served primarily as teachers and copyists, people who copied and people who taught. However, when there was limited access to the prophets, such as some periods of time when the Jews were in exile, like in Babylonian exile, they didn't always have prophets with them. Scribes, who were experts in the law of Moses, took on important duties and fulfilled powerful roles. So when they were away from the temple, because they were scattered among the nations, and when the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, the Jews couldn't worship. So they turned instead to study within the synagogues, which are actually schools. They weren't actually places of worship, okay? Because the temple was the place where you worshiped. But that's where the experts were on the law of Moses, and they took on important duties and fulfilled powerful roles. When the Jews were in Babylonian exile, scribes worked to help keep their people's faith alive and to retain their national identity. They were people of the book, and the book is what they focused on to keep their identity, even though they were dispersed among the nations. And that happens twice. It happens at Babylon, it happens after the conquering of Rome, where there's another diaspora in 70 AD. Okay? During the exile, scribes organized small groups to study the law of Moses and the history of their people. Okay? And those were sort of whatever congregations there were, because they didn't worship and couldn't sacrifice at the temple. This is I don't think, it's hard to imagine the catastrophe that this was to the Jewish people, okay, or to the children of Israel. Their land was promised to them in perpetuity by God, and it was conquered. And their temple to the only true God was destroyed, and they couldn't worship, okay? In modern times, our temples are kind of the pinnacle of worship, but we can still do weekly worship outside of the temple, okay? These people could not. They couldn't perform ordinances They couldn't worship outside the temple. So it was a real turning point in Judaism, okay? Matthew chapter 5, verse 23 through 26. This is a little admonition that he gives us. And it's sometimes we read it, and I don't think we read it sometimes in the right order. It's about, so Christ goes and he talks a little bit on the Sermon on the Mount about how we pray. He gives the Lord's Prayer. He says, when you go to pray, you don't like send out trumpets and a brass band to let everybody know that you're praying. You pray in secret. And what you pray for in secret, the Lord rewards openly. He also talks about making contributions or giving alms. And again, you don't lead a parade down the street saying, "Hi, I'm gonna contribute to charity. I'm gonna go help the poor." You do it secretly so that you can be rewarded by God, right? And then as an extension of that, he says, therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and thou rememberest thy brother hath aught against thee, if you go to the altar to make a sacrifice or to make a contribution, and you remember that somebody has something against you, not that you remember if you have something against somebody else, but you have to scour your brain to say, is it possible that I've offended someone? Leave there thy gift before the altar and go thy way. First be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift. Okay? I think we think about this backwards. And it's good if we go to the altar and we recognize that somebody's offended us and we want to go and be reconciled. But the responsibility is even stronger than if we have offended somebody. And then the second piece of advice is agree with thine adversary quickly whilst thou art in the way with him at the time. Okay? Lest at any time that the adversary deliver thee unto the judge, and the judge delivers thee to the officer, and thou be cast into prison. Okay? Verily I say unto thee, thou shalt by no means come out thence, you won't get out of there, till you have paid the uttermost farthing, till you've paid the last tiny bit of money. Remember, prisons this time are not necessarily, it's more typical for prisons to be a place where you go when you are in debt. It's like debtors' prisons. If you ever read Charles Dickens, a lot of people go to prison because they're in debt and they have to stay under arrest until they can pay the fine to get out. Okay? And a lot of Dickens novels rely on that. Oliver Twist, David Copperfield. There's a lot of them where the parent you find a child who is allowed to leave the prison. They live in the prison with their parents, but they're allowed to leave so they can make money to pay the debt for their parents to get out. Okay, so it isn't like now we think of prisons more like where felons go, and this was more like where indebted people go. Okay. So there's farthing again. Then in Matthew chapter 5, the last part, verses 27 through 44, there's established a pattern, okay? You'll see that he begins this series of verses with, and it has been said, or you have heard it hath been said, and that he fills in the blank, but I say unto you, which is be, okay? And it's a new, and it establishes a kind of new standard. So in verses 27 through 30, we talk about adultery and sin. So, for example, I'll just read that one. Matthew 27 says, ye have heard that it was said by them of old, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, see, there's the A, but I say unto you, that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery already with her in his heart. So there's a new standard. It's not just outward action. It's about changing your heart. And it continues with, if your right eye offend you, pluck it out. If thy right hand offend thee, cut it off, because it's better for you to be without it than for it, that habit or that vision, to lead you away. It's better for you not to look, not to see, not to do, than it is for that to lead you away from the gospel. 31 through 32 talk about divorce. 33 through 37 talks about oaths and swearing. Typically, in that period, you took an oath, and the more serious it was, the more you took an oath on something that was important. Okay, so the joke in a lot of like the Arabian Nights is, I swear by my mother's beard, which doesn't exist. So it's not a very reliable oath. Okay, but when you read about the oath and covenant of the priesthood, he's the Lord swears by himself that certain things will occur. Okay, so this says you don't control very much, so don't swear by anything other than just yes and no. Don't do extravagant oaths about things because you can't control those things. 38 through 42 talks about, you've heard of old, it's been taught that there's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that, for example, I say unto you that you resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Okay? And if a man sue thee at the law and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. So don't fight, submit. Okay? And then verses 42 through 48 talk about love and hate. 42 says, 43 through 48. You have heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. 44, but I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he makes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain to the just and the unjust. For if you love people who love you, what reward have you? Don't even publicans, don't even like the people that you scorn, the tax gatherers and sinners do the same? And if you only salute your brothers, how are you doing anything more than anybody else? Be therefore perfect or complete, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. Perfect in Hebrew is like, my experience is in Japanese. When something is kanzen or perfect, it means it's over, it's fully grown, it's matured. So when a meal is over, for example, you say it's kanzen, it's perfect. When a fruit is fully ripe, it's kanzen, it's perfect, it's fully developed. It doesn't mean like today, originally in English, perfect meant that. But today, more and more it means without flaw. And that's not the meaning of the English at the time of the King James Version. Okay? So any questions about this? This pattern happens in chapter 5. So if you're studying together, it's interesting to take a look at, this was the law. This is what you've heard. This is what you've been taught as part of the law. This is what I tell you is the gospel. Okay? All right. Then I'm just going to go on, even though this reading is for the next week, I'm just going to go on with these since they're all part of it. You'll see these are just the headings of Matthew chapters 6 and 7. Jesus continues the Sermon on the Mount. He just teaches the disciples the Lord's Prayer. They're commanded to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Chapter 7, Jesus concludes the Sermon on the Mount. So all these 3 chapters are one sermon. So even though we break it up in the reading, it's important to recognize that they're one sermon, one event. He concludes the Sermon on the Mount. He commands, judge not, ask of God, beware of false prophets, and then he promises salvation to those who do the will of the Father. Okay? And then at the very end of this is a little bit, we're going to go back to the scribes for a minute, but at the very end of this, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, this is the reaction. And it came to pass, when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at his doctrine. His doctrine is his teachings. Okay? For he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. So let's review a little bit about the scribes. It was the business of the scribes to develop the law in detail and apply it to the circumstances of their time. Hence grew up the oral or traditional law side by side with the written law. And the Pharisees were very much oral law. The stuff that we've talked about is as valid as what's in the law of Moses, okay? Their method of teaching relied on memorization, okay? Not hard to believe because scribes were the ones who were responsible for copying out the scriptures. Their aim was to reproduce and teach others to reproduce accurately the words of wise men, generally the prophets or people who were wise. Hence, the office is a symbol of fidelity and instruction. That's in Matthew 13:52. This is interesting about how the scribes teach. The scribes never taught on their own authority. Contrast that with the Lord's method, which is the reference is Matthew 7:29, what we're looking at. They quoted other leaders. That was their method of teaching. So-and-so taught this, so-and-so taught this, and they would reference that. Christ, it says, taught as one having authority and not as the scribes, okay? He didn't quote authorities, he taught with authority, okay? So that's a difference between Christ's teaching and the teachings that they were used to, especially in relationship to the scribes, okay? There's lots of material in that second part. I don't want to go over a ton of it unless you've read something and you have a question about it, or if you read something and you do. Let's talk a little bit, do a little bit of an overview of the Gospel of Luke, and then we'll look at the one chapter in Luke that is part of our reading for this week. The Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles form a single narrative. They're written by the same author and share unifying themes. Both are addressed in a preface to Theophilus, which means lover of God. And so you'll see in the Gospel of Luke, in fact, I'll just read it to you. The first verse says, "Forasmuch as many have taken in hand to set forth an order, a declaration of those things which are most surely believed among us, even as they were delivered them unto us, which were from the beginning eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemeth good to me also, having had a perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus, that thou mightest know that with the certainty of these things wherein thou hast been instructed." So that's a little preface before we get to the famous Christmas part. It was in the days of King Herod of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias, and you get the story of Zacharias. That's at the beginning of Luke. At the beginning of Acts, we have something similar, okay? The beginning of Acts says, those are the first 4 verses. "The former treatise," meaning the book of Luke, "I have made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and teach, until that day which in which he was taken up, after he had through the Holy Ghost given commandments unto the apostles to whom he had chosen." Verse 3, "To whom he also showed himself after his passion," or his suffering, "by many infallible proofs, being seen of them 40 days, and speaking of things pertaining unto the kingdom of God." So again, is a reference to Theophilus, okay? Theophilus means lover of God, and Theophilus could mean an individual person's name, like a person, or it could refer to a group, a community of God lovers, okay? So I just think that's an interesting take. It may not be a person, it might be you who love God, okay? The author of the Gospel of Luke is not named in the written text. Christians in the 2nd century assigned authorship to Luke, and they stipulated that it was this Luke who was the companion of Paul in 50 AD that you read about in Acts, okay? But nowhere does the book itself, the text itself, say that it was written by Luke. Tradition assigns it to Luke, and tradition assigns it to that missionary companion of Paul. So a little bit more of an overview. A major theme in Luke's gospel is the Spirit. Jesus is conceived by the Spirit, okay? So Luke starts way early, as the story of Elizabeth, Zacharias and John the Baptist, Elizabeth and Mary, and that he's conceived by the Spirit. At baptism, the Spirit descends upon him. The first words of his public ministry, he goes to the synagogue. He opens the book and quotes from Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." And he reads a few more verses and he says, "This day, this prophecy is fulfilled." Okay. His last words from the cross are, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." And Luke's gospel ends with Jesus' promise that the Spirit will descend upon his followers. And in fact, that even continues in the book of Acts, because one of the first things that happens in the book of Acts is the Epiphany, when the Spirit descends on all of the followers at once. Okay, so with Paul, and they're all talking and understanding one another because the Spirit descends on all of them like tongues of fire. Okay, so on the day of Pentecost, which is 20 days after the Pentecost. It's 50 days after Passover. Okay, so Luke contains several hundred verses that are unique to his gospel, including the stories of Jesus' conception and birth. Matthew has the visitation of the shepherds, but parables like the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the woman and the lost coin, the Pharisees and the tax collector. No, Luke contains the shepherds, okay? The Pharisees and the tax collector, the dishonest steward, the widow and the unjust judge, okay? The story of the risen Jesus appearing on the road to Emmaus, to the eunuch and to somebody else, and they're talking with him, and they're asking what's happened, and he explains to them about Jesus, and then he disappears, and they ask each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us?" Okay. The Gospel of Luke emphasizes marginalized peoples, the Gentiles, shepherds, tax collectors, the unclean. And there are more stories and incidents featuring women than in any other gospel. The story of Mary and Elizabeth, the story of the raising of Lazarus with the dialogue between Mary and Martha is in the book of Luke, okay? And stories about raising of the widow's son. And these women typically have things to say. They don't in other gospels, okay? So when we start in Luke chapter 6, which is what we're starting for the reading for this week, it's the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, and then Luke chapter 6. And it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first, that when he went through the cornfields, and his disciples plucked ears of corn and did eat, rubbing them in their hands. So just a reminder of the King James vocabulary. Corn in King James's time does not mean maize, okay? What we would call corn, because that's a product of the New World. It was brand new to the Old World, to Europe at the time. Corn just means grain. So they're going through the fields of grain, wheat or barley or whatever, and they pluck the ears of corn and they rub the husks off with their hands, okay, in order to eat on the Sabbath, okay? According to the law of Moses, farmers should leave the edges of their fields unharvested. Those are called the peah. They should not pick up which was dropped, meaning gleaning. If they're harvested and they're dropped, you don't pick those up. You leave those, and should not harvest any overlooked produce that has been forgotten when they harvested the majority of the field. That's in Leviticus 19:9, Leviticus 23:22, and Deuteronomy 24 through 19, okay? And it also says further in Deuteronomy that those are to be left for the poor. So remember in the book of Ruth, you have Ruth and her mother-in-law coming back to the children of Israel from Moab, okay? And in order to eat, they go to Boaz's field while they are harvesting, and they gather the gleaning, what's left on the ground, okay? And Boaz sees it, and he tells his harvesters, leave a bunch of stuff behind because I want this Ruth and her mother to be able to eat. Okay. The disciples are doing that same thing. They're going through the field. If they're too poor, you can go through the field and you can gather up or glean the leftovers. Okay. That was part of the any kind of a law of Moses safety net, taking care of the poor. Okay. So the Pharisees see that they're doing this and they're like, why are you people gathering on the harvest? That's forbidden. That's breaking the Sabbath. And Jesus, in fact, in verse 2, it says this. Luke 6:2 says, I'll just read it very specifically. Let's see if I can find it. Luke 6:2. And certain of the Pharisees said unto them, why do you do that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath days? And then Jesus answering them said, have ye not read so much as this, what David did when he himself was an hungered, and they which were with him? How he went to the house of God, and did take and eat the showbread, and gave also to them that were with him, which was not lawful to eat, but for the priests alone. That is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 6. So David is going through with his armies, okay, with his people who are with him, and they're starving, and they go to the temple, and they eat the showbread, which is part of the temple, which was only according to the law of Moses, to be eaten by the priests in the temple. Okay, remembering that David was the king, and remembering that Christ is a direct descendant of David. Okay, so the showbread in the tabernacle is here. This is in the tabernacle. It's the same setup in the temple. Okay, you have the altar of burnt offering. You have the courtyard. You have the laver of water. You go into the holy place. This is the actual building part of it, or the tent. This is open. Okay, this is the tent. And if you've seen the recreation of the tabernacle up at it's up at Alma Madson's house, near his house. You'll recognize this. So you go into the part, and here's are the golden lampstand, okay, the menorah, and here's the table of showbread. Here's the incense altar, okay, and here is the curtain, and here is the Holy of Holies with the Ark of the Covenant. So it's in here. Now, they don't break into the temple. They don't go into the temple, but they beg the showbread from the priests and eat it. And Christ references that incident, and nobody criticizes David for doing that, even though it was only to be meant for them. Okay, so in response to their after that, in Luke 6:5, he says, and he said unto them, the Pharisees who were questioning him, that the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Okay, and the Sabbath is not made for man, but man for the man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. In Luke, he says, the Son of Man, or himself, is the Lord of the Sabbath. I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. So don't tell me what I can or cannot do, okay? In Luke chapter 6, which is you read, what we're set to read, Jesus heals on the Sabbath. He chooses his 12 apostles. First he eats on the Sabbath, then he heals. Chooses his 12 apostles. He pronounces the blessings upon the obedient and the woes upon the wicked. And it's here where in Luke chapter 6, you'll get a reiteration in verses 20 through 26. It's a reiteration of the Beatitudes, okay? Beatitude comes from the Latin root word as the same as to beatify or to make blessed. So the word we use beatify is in the Catholic Church. The saints, when they're making saints, the last step is that they're beatified or they're made blessed. Okay, so beatitude just means the statements that are blessed are. Okay, because beatitudes are the blessed words. Okay, the words of being blessed. Okay, So right after, in Luke 6:5, the Pharisees are criticizing him on the Sabbath for eating, for actually, it probably isn't eating, it's probably the work of gleaning, doing that on the Sabbath, of rubbing their hands together to get the chaff off so that they can eat. Okay? And he says, the Son of Man is also Lord of this. The Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Then he goes to the synagogue and he heals someone who has palsy. And in the midst of that, they criticize him. And in fact, it's one where he says, "Thy sins are forgiven thee," and they're like, "What?" And he's like, "Well, is it easier to say that or to rise up and walk?" But they criticize him first for doing that on the Sabbath. And Christ says to them, "I ask you one thing: is it lawful on the Sabbath days to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it?" And his contention is to save life and to do good is part of the work of the Sabbath. It's not all these little rulity rules that you have made up. Okay. All right. And then in Luke chapter 6, verse 31, we get an iteration of the golden rule. And as you would that men should do to you, do ye also unto them likewise. So there's a tiny bit of overlap in Luke, besides the Beatitudes, a few of the teachings afterwards about, turn the other cheek and give thy cloak, and if you love them, in 32, right after 31, if you love them which love you, what thank have you? For sinners also love those that love them. If you do good to them which do good to you, what thank have you? For sinners also even do the same. Okay, so he reiterates some of the teachings, but not in the same order and not to the extent of Matthew, which may be one of the reasons why we're asked to look at Luke. I would suggest that as a personal or a family study, you might compare what we have in this last part of Luke to what we have in Matthew and just see how, compare and contrast. Okay, so that's what I have prepared for today. Are there any questions or anything that I can clarify? I can look at the chat and see if anybody's chatted me anything, or you can just come unmute. Bueller?
No, just another excellent presentation, Brother Clark. Yeah, I just, it's funny. When Jesus went, especially when he went to the synagogue and he read that passage from
it's from Isaiah.
Isaiah, thank you. Basically declared himself, prophet.
Yeah.
That's
it's me.
Just the reaction from all the people in that room, and I'm guessing that's where kind of the what's the word I'm looking for?
The animosity
Yeah,
begins.
exactly. Right.
Yeah. So here's another interesting thing that I learned as I was researching the Gospels. In all of the other Gospels, especially Mark and Matthew, he does not declare that he is the Savior. He doesn't let that out until right before his death. You know what I mean? So in some of the Gospels, he doesn't even acknowledge that until he's finished with the work. Okay, it's only in the book of John that sets up that he is testifying all the time that I am this, I am this, I am this. In the other Gospels, it's very quiet. So sometimes you'll read in the Gospels where he heals people and he says, don't tell anybody. Keep this to yourselves. I don't think it's because he's afraid. I just think that he doesn't declare who he is until the work is done in the earlier Gospels.
Right.
On, it's slightly different. Okay.
Yeah.
So when we get a chance to study a little bit about the uniqueness of the book of John, that will come out. But it's just something to look for, and it's not consistent among the Gospels. And so, you know what I mean? If, for example, I was to write a history of my father's life, okay, I would have to rely on a lot of stuff that I didn't experience, and my history would be very different from, like, some of you know my youngest sister Colina, then Colina's or Jenny's history. It doesn't mean that one of them is true and the other is not. It's just they have different emphases. They have different things.
Yeah, viewpoints.
Make
Right.
the study of the gospel interesting and beautiful. And I think sometimes it's good to study it harmonized, like these events go here, but sometimes it's good to just take a look at one and then the other, because you get a different kind of perspective about things. So anyhow, what we're reading for this week is Matthew chapter 5, Luke chapter 6, and then for next week, it's Matthew 6 and 7. And then when we meet again, after that, what we're going to take a look at is, just so you know, it's not very much. It's going to be Matthew 8, Mark 2 through 4, and Luke 7, and then Matthew 9 and 10, Mark 5, and Luke 9. It's more chapters, but it's okay. You know what I mean? And there's more repetition of the story. You know,
right.
It's not all on one or the other. You read different versions of the same material. So anyway, that's that. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. I'm going to say thank you for attending. Thank you to those of you who are watching on YouTube later when Brother Lee sets that up. And we'll meet again in 2 weeks. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Brother Clark, again for another excellent lesson. Always appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and leave, and then you can stop the